Hello, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome William Fong. William is the head of keyboard at the Purcell School of Music and also professor at the Royal Academy of Music in London.
Sure. Well, Julia, I'm very pleased to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. William, just really, I think, first of all, to cover some challenges, if you mind, that the school faced. You are a boarding school as well, and what did the Purcell has had to do in that difficult time?
Well, I think it was probably similar to quite a lot of boarding schools around the country. In the end, we had to make the decision in the middle of March to close the school physically. And that, of course, presented some problems in itself. We have a really quite a considerable international community. And we wanted to make sure that as many of those, if they wished to go back to their home countries, would be able to do so before the borders were closed down and things like that. So I think our principal, Paul Bamborough, acted incredibly quickly and decisively about that. So mostly it worked out well. We had a few who, for one reason or another, were stranded in the UK, but even there we still had good provision for them with guardians, or they stayed with friends or friends of family. So all in all, it worked out okay, as well as it could be under the circumstances.
Of course. Oh, that's very challenging. Um, must have been really difficult for those that were not able to go back home, right?
Yeah, pretty difficult. And there are still some who are waiting to be able to go back to their home countries. I believe most of them will be able to by the end of this month, but it was only a handful, and they've been very well looked after. The school has kept in touch with all of those. As you can imagine, we pretty quickly moved into online teaching, and that wasn't restricted simply to instrumental lessons,
Sure.
but also a pretty good, as comprehensive as it could be, a pretty good academic curriculum as well.
Hmm.
So we were in touch with all the students. If for one reason or another they didn't check in, we would try and find out what was happening.
Sure. Yes, very, very interesting. You touched the subject of online teaching. So, I mean, for you as the head of the department, how was it for your department? I'm asking about the teachers now.
Yeah, okay. Um, Pretty terrible, truth be told. Um, it took us a little bit of time to figure out which were the best platforms for piano specifically. I think some of the other departments um, were more successful, but as you well know, Julia, we have this wonderful instrument, but it has a huge, uh, wide uh, audio range.
Sure,
It has a huge dynamic range. Also, the compass of the piano is larger than most instruments.
sure,
I can think of maybe one or two
sure.
instruments that have a larger compass, but none of the platforms are really designed to cope with that. They like to compress the sound.
Yeah.
I'm sure all the other teachers, professors you've been speaking with probably have related similar experiences. So that's been challenging. Teachers have got around it by either asking their students to record their repertoire in advance and send them before a live online lesson, or a few of us have decided, in addition to that, to use something like Source Connect, which is an audio link with a separate microphone, and then use one of the other platforms on another device to get the video. But it's not perfect, and one of the
Sure,
things that I think um, we've very much missed is this kind of sense of feedback and
sure.
give and take. And certainly also with a delay, it's not possible always to do the same things as you can when you're teaching one to one in the same room.
Hmm.
So there are lots of challenges. I think It's interesting, though. I think everyone has managed pretty well. And indeed, some of the pianists, I suspect, have flourished with lots and lots of practice time that they wouldn't have already ordinarily had. So, maybe there have been some positive outcomes as well.
Sure. Could you elaborate a little bit? But I think it's very interesting for many, this sort of separate audio file, because I don't think actually we have talked about this in this series. So I think that would be really helpful.
Well, there, I think one or two high quality audio links that are available on the internet. Source Connect is one of them. Uh, Currently, it's a free application.
Hmm.
And so you run that on your laptop. I have also that you can use a laptop microphone. That's fine. I have decided to, for example, invest in a pretty good microphone, which has its own kind of condensed microphone, which has its own kind of amplifier, plugs straight into the laptop. So use the audio link to for the obviously for the sound element of the lesson. You then use either Zoom, WhatsApp, any of the other platforms for the video, but you need to mute the sound on the video. So you have two applications working at the same time.
Hmm. Hmm.
And also, it's possible that's helpful in terms of if you've got a rather old laptop and doesn't have all the memory or capabilities that a newer one, to have two separate elements, two separate devices working simultaneously.
Hmm. Very interesting. Thank you.
That's been the probably the most successful. The sound quality of the piano is still not great, but at least you hear something, and you're not always just guessing what your student is doing simply by uh, what it looks like.
Sure, of course. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And just to ask you again, about these technologies and things. I mean, uh, of course, there is a problem about safeguarding, online things, especially. So, how did the Purcell School react to that? Do you use again special application, or is it recorded?
What we do is at the beginning of a lesson, one family member, an adult, preferably the father or the mother, has to be present at the very beginning of the
Hmm.
lesson, just to make sure it's all right. And that's as far as our safeguarding
Sure.
goes with that.
Hmm.
That's I think
Yes, of course.
yeah.
But how was the parents' reaction to this? Were they happy that the lessons actually continue, or did some sort of I don't know, complain, or was it an easy relationship with parents?
I haven't had any negative feedback from any of the teachers at Purcell, and certainly my experience was that it was very positive. I think the parents were very very happy that the school made an effort to, even if imperfect, the school made an effort to keep some continuity. And I have to say, a lot of the teachers did a fantastic job. I'm very, very grateful to them by teaching over the East holidays.
Yeah.
So, right from lockdown up till the end of last week, a lot of teaching was going all the way through, including through half term as well.
Right.
So, I'm very, very grateful to them for that.
Yeah.
I think they did a fantastic job.
Yeah. What were the positives of this? Because actually quite a few people sort of said that there have been really surprising positives coming out of such strange exercises, online teaching.
Well, yes, it is very interesting. I don't know whether it's simply the nature that everyone's at home and maybe uh, there's a less formal sense of the lesson, but I suspect it's almost as simple as a lot of the students found they had much more time
Hmm.
to think about what they had to do. Also, to a degree, they had to be pretty self-sufficient, quite self-sufficient, and do things that they wouldn't ordinarily be expected to do on their own all the time.
Hmm.
Particularly for younger students, there are times in the piano lessons when a lot of, if you like, a certain amount of practice takes place,
Sure.
but that's not possible on an online lesson. So they had to start working it out for themselves. They probably also had to be quite mature and start organizing their time for themselves.
Yeah.
Again, that I think is requires quite a lot of self-motivation, and I'm very happy that I think all the piano students, to a greater or lesser degree, gained a lot from that.
Hmm. Gosh, I mean, I'm sure it's very difficult, especially for for younger students. But it teaches you a lot, right? It's quite an interesting experiment, I think, psychologically. Really, how you deal with your time, and sometimes you think you have all the time in the world, but it's actually not
No,
that much.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that was something that a lot of students found. I think not only students, I think a lot of adults did as well, that it seemed as though we had a lot of time. And yet, strangely, days would go by very, very quickly,
Sure.
almost without realizing. And that's because I think, to begin with, it was more difficult without having this kind of formal structure in place.
Sure.
And as you say, as we say, that a lot of students eventually had to find a way to organize their time, structure their day, so that it didn't just run away.
And William, have you kept any performances or group classes going during this time?
We've tried to, we have indeed. Usually, when we're at school, physically at school, there are three faculty classes each week. One for each section of the school. The low school, that's years 6 to 8, the middle school, years 9 to 11, and the sixth form. They see me each week for about an hour. Online, we kept those going, although it's not very easy to manage 12 pianists in the faculty class in one go. So in the end, what we did was split all the pianists into 8 groups. Broadly speaking, in the same year groups. And so I would see them each week. It was a great way to touch base with all of them to see how they're doing,
Sure.
make sure their lessons were going well, but also to give them a few projects. So, for example, I gave them some listening projects. One group, we made a comparison between different recordings, for example, of La Cathédrale Engloutie, because I was very interested to see if they would spot the difference, for example, of Giesecke's recording
Yes.
and Debussy's piano roll recording, and to see exactly whether Debussy follows his written score
Yes.
with the timing and the pulse. And so that was interesting too. And also, I got one group to listen to choose a pre-1960 recording and a post-1960 recording of the Volstein, so that they could then, as a group, over the week, get online, discuss the 2 recordings they'd chosen, and to see what the stylistic differences were between the 2 recordings. So it was, again, to try and make all the pianists engage with them as a group, rather than all of us being isolated. And then they would come back to me each week and report and discuss the results, and I would lead the conversation about that. Another project was that within the groups, I'd ask them to curate a concert from the repertoire that they were studying, and to find a theme from particular pieces in their repertoire, and to see whether they could come up with a concert. And they did that last week online. And they also, of course, because it's Zoom and the sound quality wasn't very good, they also did backup recordings. So we're hoping to edit those and then publish those recordings over the course of the summer holidays. And
Gosh.
one group did a very interesting thing. They chose a repertoire from their home nations. So there was repertoire from Bulgaria, Turkey, Spain, and they even curated in such a way that they wore the colours of their national colours.
Wow.
So it was fun. It was to keep it lively like that.
Oh, that's really fun. And I think it's terrific. I'm sure many would take this on board. I mean, I think I would take this on board. It's really, I think curation, especially now, becomes very important, for, artists and your proposals, let's say. Yeah, so
Yeah.
very interesting. And what was the reaction of the students to Debussy's recording? Because it's quite different. I mean, all of these older recordings, they're very specific, aren't they?
It was interesting because they found Debussy's playing slightly curious. And I mean, there's no question that Debussy's playing is incredibly colourful. You can hear that even through the piano roll, which is not, if you like, not a perfect audio medium either. But they found it very fluid and yet very clear playing.
Hmm.
So that was interesting. And, it made them think a little bit more about other recordings of composers that they could actually access as well. And of course, the most famous ones are Rachmaninoff. Um, so I guided them in that way. Another group, I asked them to find recordings of famous female pianists as well, so that again they have a broad knowledge of all the pianists that were famous over the course of the 20th century, for
Sure,
example, and not just the male pianists.
sure, sure.
Yeah.
Fascinating. It's really also such a great tool, right? YouTube or online records, something that wasn't available when even I started. We had to go to the library, and if the pandemic was, we would be left just without anything really. That I mean, just with home collections.
Very
Very,
true.
very interesting. And so, what do you think about, because we've touched the subject of the recording, of classical music moving rapidly into the online world? And, now I'm pretty sure almost every concert will be streamed. And do you think that will impact the performance itself, that you're kind of streamed?
I think it may do. I think it's like anything, though. Once you get used to it, it'll be the new normal.
Hmm.
But I agree with you. I think a lot more things are going to be streamed. My worry is that when we do that, and if we do that exclusively, we lose a certain feeling of the physicality of going to a concert, the immediacy. Of course, it'll be live, but there's still an immediacy, a shared reaction when you sit in an audience of a live concert, I think. And for the performer, I think that is something also that one feels when you're on stage, that immediacy of reaction.
Yeah. Mm.
So I'm hoping that we will find a way to reopen the concert halls. I think that's really important, and I imagine a lot of concerts will be streamed. And of course, in some ways, that makes things more accessible, and that has to be also be a positive. But I should hope that it's not at the expense of actual live concerts that you can go and hear physically
Sure.
and be in the presence of in the same hall.
Yes, of course. But So what do you think about, again, touching the subject, but from the performance point of view? And, when we, of course, record in a studio, there is always the position of we could re-record, and that's sort of that element of spontaneity. It's kind of it's there, but you always have that option of re-recording. So, do you think that the presence of the camera will make people, performers, I'm talking about, more aware of their sort of, let's say, technical imperfections or something? Do you think someone would be less free or like on the stage?
That's a good question. I think inevitably there'll be a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the pursuit of perfection in recordings will probably spill over to that as well, to streamed and video recorded concerts too.
Yeah.
Although, who knows? Maybe again, if stream concerts are the new normal, then people may be more willing to accept some sort of imperfection in concerts.
Mm.
Difficult to say, but
Yeah.
I think initially, if you're giving a concert, you want to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. And sadly, that will mean, in some cases, that people might be less free and willing to take musical artistic risks.
Mm. Interesting. That's what my worry is, but yeah, I'm sure there will be an adaptation. I mean, there is an adaptation to almost anything. But I see a lot of scores on your piano, and I also suspect that the school, of course, has a lot of scores, right? So were there some things that you were not able to have from home? I don't know. Do you have an iPad? And the question about sort of editions. So that's
Yes,
quite interesting, actually.
it is very interesting. And I have to say that I've got a pretty extensive library of piano scores here at home, but it's not absolutely comprehensive. And one of my students was learning the Janacek Sonata, and I don't have that here. So one of the great things, again, about the age that we live in is that a lot of scores are downloadable through ISMLP. And the technology even exists. Once you've downloaded them, you can use your finger to annotate them as you go along in a lesson. So it works pretty well. So it wasn't completely desperate. So again, pretty lucky that if you like, the positive thing is that we live in an age where it's possible to teach from home and have most of the tools that we need to carry out lessons in a productive manner.
Hmm. Very interesting. And what are the plans? I don't know if you can maybe disclose if you had made that decision for September and onwards for the school.
It's not absolutely clear.
Right.
As far as I can gather from the senior leadership team and Paul Bambra, announcements will be made in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Hmm.
But broadly speaking, the school will be obliged to follow government guidelines.
Yes.
And if the government says you've got to open, it's going to be, as far as I can see and understand, it's going to be quite difficult to resist that. So, if that is the case, and I know that the school at the moment is working very, very hard to put in place provision to mitigate the effects of the virus, but also, and as far as possible, to keep students and staff safe.
Of course.
But in the end, you will be obliged to open if that's what the government
Sure.
specifies.
I guess it's so uncertain. Also, as with concert halls, you can have one week, I guess, stage four, and pretty everyone will be happy, and the next week it might be, stage one, and everything is shut. I think it's almost impossible to plan, right? Very, very,
Yeah.
yeah. It's
I mean, I
but
know that, for example, I also teach at the Royal Academy of Music, and I know that the Royal Academy of Music is now open, but only for final year students
right.
for their deferred exams that are taking place at the end of August, beginning of September.
Fantastic. Yes, of course. Yes. But may I ask you a final question, if you don't mind? What would be your advice to all the younger, aspiring, and let's say musicians, not only pianists, at this time?
Uh, my advice would be use this time to be musically curious, listen to lots of things that you might not have otherwise listened to, be excited about discovering new music. When I say new music, it doesn't need to be absolutely contemporary, but new to them, and allow your imagination to roam freely. And within that, also organize your time so that you know when you're going to be practicing, what you're going to be practicing, but also factor in time where you can recharge the batteries, relax as well to get that balance right. And eat well and drink well and sleep well. That's my advice. And be healthy. Um, I think it was Rachmaninoff who said that if my legs don't walk, my fingers can't run.
That's a very interesting advice. Thank you very, very much for being my guest, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
You too, Yulia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.